YouTube is funny sometimes. My most watched video, which I'm really proud of, is my video about the Fuji XE4, which is the digital camera that I've primarily used since buying it. I really haven't used any other digital camera except that little point and shoot that I did a video about last time. But I made that video about a year ago, so it's been probably a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer, since I've had my Fuji XE4. That video has since gotten 39,000 views, which for a teeny tiny little channel like mine is amazing. I've watched that video a couple times since making it, and I gotta say I still definitely feel the same way that I do now than I did when I made that video about this camera. I'm proud of that video because I feel like, as simple as it is, I mean, I filmed it on my phone, I didn't even use a fancy microphone or anything. I feel like I got a point across that mattered to a lot of people and mattered to me. And look, I'm not gonna sit here and be a brand shill or anything like that. If someone comes along with something that's better, maybe eventually I'll jump to that. But for right now, I really enjoy Fuji and what they're doing, and I really enjoy this camera. And I think there is a case for this camera for the right user. And I've gotten a lot of comments on that video of people telling me this is exactly what I've been thinking, but you just put it into words, and I'm super proud of that. So if it helped you in any way in making your decision and you've posted a comment on that video talking about the camera and sharing your feelings, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. And since then, I've talked about this camera a lot with my friends in person and online in different photo communities. I've used it quite a bit. And I've been thinking about making a follow-up video. So that's what this is today. I'm gonna start by reiterating my point that I feel the same way about this camera that I always have. Its size and form factor and the results and the shooting experience, it just clicks with the way that I like to work. The way that I kind of have it set up, and again, the kind of kit that I have built around this camera really leaves me no excuse to leave the house without a camera. It's just incredibly easy to pick up and use. And the lenses that I like to use really just fit into this idea of grab and go, and it works for me. Like I mentioned in my other video when I was talking about this camera, my favorite cameras are those simple film cameras, the mechanical ones, the very bare bones stuff. I generally find that doing too much just doesn't really work for me. When I try to overstep the boundaries that I set for myself, I am not going to make as good of work as I possibly can. I just don't have the mental capacity, the bandwidth to think like that. So a camera like this fits the way that I think and the way that I see the world of photography and the way that I like to work. So that being said, I'm going to give a bit of a breakdown on how I use the camera, how I have it set up. It's really nothing fancy or really nothing special. And I'm gonna go over the lens kit that I've kind of built around this camera and what I use each of those lenses for. And lastly, I kind of wanna just go over some thoughts regarding the discourse around Fuji cameras, specifically the XE4, stuff like the X100V, and the relation between film and digital and how these cameras fit into that discussion, and just again, some general thoughts about the camera and some things that I've seen being said about the camera, and I'll wrap it up from there. So I'm gonna move some things around and I'm gonna get the camera in front of a camera to give you guys a closer look at how I set everything up, and we'll talk about that first. So let's go over how I usually have the camera set up and how I go about shooting with the camera. So when it comes to shooting this camera, I will say that I primarily use manual mode. It's just how I like to shoot. I find it the most convenient way to do things when I can just kind of control my exposure, especially not having in-body image stabilization. I'll often, if I'm in a low light situation, will opt for a little bit of underexposure to keep my shutter speeds a little bit higher. And that's just really convenient to do and manipulate when you're using manual mode. I also set the Q menu to different situations that I find myself in. I have just a regular raw profile that I use pretty much all of the time. I have a profile for scanning because I do scan all of my film with this camera. And then I have a couple JPEG profiles that I don't use all the time, but they're occasionally fun to pop into. I find that the film simulations, as great as they are, still need a little bit of work. They never quite have like enough contrast or quite the right colors. I still need to tweak them ever so slightly, so I just prefer to shoot in RAW, and it kind of, again, adds to some of the like grab and go nature. When I'm not really looking for shots that work specifically for the film preset that I'm using, I don't have to worry about that. I could just take photos and edit them later. That just works for me when I use this camera. Really, my entire goal when it comes to using this camera is to just focus on, what it's great for. The grab and go nature, the simplicity is great to focus on the type of shooting that I like to do. I don't think about doing types of photography that just don't work. Those leave my brain space, and it allows me more ability to think about the things that I do like to take photos with, and it allows me to focus on those things much more intently. So manual mode for that type of shooting generally works best in my opinion, but I occasionally do use the auto exposure mode. So I love the lenses that have actual numbered aperture dials. Those are my primary go-tos, and occasionally I will use the AEL AFL lock button if I am shooting in aperture priority or if I'm shooting in shutter priority. That is definitely very, very useful. I will say I have never back button focused. I've never done it on a digital camera. I've never really cared to do it. I've found that just focusing with the shutter button has worked just fine for me. And speaking of focus, I know one of the things that I brought up in my last video about this camera was the lack of a switch between manual focus, autofocus, and autofocus continuous. And although that will be a welcome addition to this camera, I find that it's not something that I really am hurting for or something that I find that I need all the time, mostly because I'm usually using 1 or 2 lenses at a time. I rarely have more than 2 lenses in my bag. It's a lot to juggle, and when I'm using a digital camera, I prefer to use autofocus. So my approach has been to be intentional with it. So when I put something like this 35mm lens on, I go into the menu before I start shooting and I set the camera to the focus mode that I like. Usually for this lens, it's autofocus continuous. I have set the top plate custom button to focus mode, and I find that I am switching focus mode depending on the lens way more than I'm switching the actual focus type. Although I have kept most of the stock settings on the camera, aside from the focus mode being the custom button up here, I did make sure to set the front dial to switch between ISO and shutter speed. So because I'm shooting in manual mode a lot, I generally just find that I'm using the front dial to fine-tune ISO. And if I need to use kind of like half or third stops in the shutter speed, because the shutter dial only works in full stops, I will go ahead and click in and then switch over to shutter speed, and I'm able to manipulate that way. But generally I don't find that I'm doing that all that often. It's come in handy the few times that I've used it. But again, we're talking digital here. We're talking flexible raw files. The difference between a third of a stop in the shutter speed, there really are for those niche use cases when I'm shooting in really low light and I want to maximize the quality of the file and introduce as little noise as possible. I think the best thing that you can do in setting a camera like this up for yourself, asking yourself the question, what are the situations that I'm going to be in the majority of the time, and then setting the camera up accordingly. So last, let's talk about the lens kit that I've kind of built around this camera. I have 5 lenses, but I think I've kind of landed on a very small and easy to use kit that just fits all of my use cases perfectly well. Starting off with the lens that's been on the camera this whole time is the 35mm f2, the Fuji. This is a 50mm equivalent, and I have to say that it is probably my favorite Fuji lens that I have used. Just the overall size, the build quality, the image quality, everything about this lens is just perfect. I personally find that I am using a 50mm equivalent probably 75% of the time that I'm shooting. So this was just a no-brainer purchase for me. I mean, it fits quite nicely on the camera. Next up is a lens that I have mentioned a couple times in this video already. It is the 18mm f2. One of my friends recently described this lens as the little lens that could, and I think that is a perfect spot-on description for this little pancake guy. This is a really fun walk-around pancake lens. I think it's a perfect match with the XE4. You can get rid of the grip and hold it really comfortably with a lens this small. And despite its shortcomings when it comes to its autofocus performance, I have to say probably the 2 biggest things that draw me to this lens are just the overall rendering of the images. I think there's just something special about the images that come out of this lens. And I really, really like using wide angle lenses close up, and this lens can focus really close, and at f2 you get really nice separation. Is it the same separation that you get out of like a 90mm lens that's got an f1.8 aperture? No, but for that wide angle close up dramatic look, I think it works really well. And overall, I generally just really enjoy the images that come out of this lens. Next up is a lens that pretty much everyone knows about at this point. If you know about Fuji, you know what this is. This is the 18-55 kit lens. bought this lens when I bought the camera, and it is primarily a lens I use for video. I did take it with me on vacation alongside another couple lenses, and I did use it for, you know, the long end, the 55mm end for a couple photos, and it did definitely come in handy. But I think in the future, there are a lot of really good lenses out there that get to that range, that 56mm, 75 to 85mm equivalent, that are faster and would probably serve me better as a telephoto lens. But this is a video lens for me. It works great as a video lens. It's sharp enough, it's fast enough. I pretty much just have a diffusion filter just permanently attached to it at this point. And yeah, there's not much else that I can say that hasn't already been said for this lens. Next up is another utility lens. This is the Laowa CF65mm f2.8 Dreamer Macro. This is a macro lens that I use to scan film. I really don't take macro photos. It is a very good and very sharp macro lens. It can give you beyond 1:1 magnification. It can go all the way to 2:1 magnification, which is really, 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 really close. If you're looking for a really solid macro lens, super sharp, metal build quality, just nothing bad to say about it. Price is definitely fair. This is one that I would definitely consider. And last but not least is a fun one. This is the 7 Artisans 7.5mm f2.8 fisheye lens. This is the second version of the lens. I picked this up used not too long ago for, I don't know, like $100 or something like that. Manual focus, manual controls, no electronics, none of that. This is just a blast. It's definitely not the sharpest lens in the world, but I think for what it is, it's more than enough. Has this really nice built-in metal hood, metal build quality. And fisheye is just fun, right? You can shoot at just super, super slow shutter speeds, so it's really fun to take out at night. The focusing is just dead simple. You pretty much just set the focus to infinity, and then you don't really have to worry about it unless you're trying to get really close, which I've only done like 2 times. It essentially turns the camera into a point and shoot. Results are fun, definitely more than good enough for what the lens costs and how much you would probably use something like this. I mean, if you're a super serious fisheye photographer, this is probably not what you're looking for. But if you were looking to pick up something fun, something compact, definitely easy to throw this into a bag considering its size, this is definitely one to look out for. I'm sure you can find it pretty cheap. So yeah, this is the Fuji kit that I'm working with. 90% of the time, I'm running with one lens. That's generally the 35mm or the 18mm, and sometimes even just the fisheye. If I'm gonna just grab one lens and if I wanna just do something fun or I'm gonna go out at night, fisheye, I'll grab that. If I want a compact kit, the 18 is the way to go. But if I'm primarily just shooting this camera by itself, I don't have any other cameras on me, I'm usually grabbing the 35. And often I'm grabbing the 18 and 35 together. So like I mentioned before, I want to talk about some of the ideas and thoughts and talk I see revolving around kind of the Fuji cameras and all of the YouTube thumbnails that I see and just general thoughts and all that wonderful stuff. This is my personal opinion. I'm one person with one experience that is purely anecdotal related to everyone else's experiences. I am not an expert. I am not a pro. So take my opinion for what you will. I'm not claiming to be an expert. This is just how I feel. I think the obvious first place to start when it comes to kind of like the XE4, the X100, just Fuji cameras in general, is that they are a good replacement for film. I disagree with that entirely. Relatively speaking, in terms of digital, I guess they give you an experience that is comparable to film. But I think this will always be an apples and oranges comparison. I just think at the end of the day, you cannot replace the physical process and nature of film with digital and say that they're comparable. I think the reality is if you want the closest thing that you can get to film with a digital camera, really you're looking at like a Leica M10D or the 262D, the ones without rear LCD screens. Like that's about as close as it gets in my opinion. And it's hard to say the same with Fujifilm. Yes, you get the more physical dials with shutter speeds and all that wonderful stuff. And it definitely provides a more mechanical, and if you use it in the right way, slower feel, but they're two different things. I just really find them hard to compare. And I think if you are thinking of jumping ship from film and buying a digital camera, you're either gonna be disappointed or you're gonna realize it was never really about the experience in the first place, and it was about creating images. So I think the reality is too, right, with film prices being the way they are, a lot of us are gonna get used to kind of shooting film and digital in conjunction with each other, and film is gonna be a bit of an accessory, a bit more of a luxury, and that's okay for a lot of people. I think those of us who really want to are gonna find ways to make it cheaper, and we're gonna be willing to put the time in and put the work in to enjoy film at a lower cost. I think those same people, if they're thinking that they can exit from film entirely and replace it with a Fujifilm camera, they're probably going to be disappointed. So I've brought up the X100V a couple times in this discussion because I think the XE4 and the X100V just get put side by side all the time. Yeah, there's also the X Pro 2, and X Pro 3 I think are really great values right now. At the time of filming this, I've seen them go up on private selling sites like Reddit Photo Market for anywhere in the ballpark between $1,300 and $1,500, which, like, compared to X100V prices is a screaming deal. Like, I don't know why anyone is paying $1,400 for an X100V when you can pay $100 more and get an X Pro 3, but to each his own. I'm not judging, that's just my opinion. But I do see the XE4 and the X100V get put side by side all the time. I think for me, it boils down to one thought. If you can't decide one way or another between these cameras, you're probably not going to like the X100V. If you don't really understand and gel with the idea of shooting with one lens on a camera all the time and really just focusing and honing in on that, you might be disappointed. But I think if you know what you're getting yourself into when it comes to that, X100V could be a really easy choice. They're pretty close, but obviously the major difference is interchangeable lenses, even though the XE4 doesn't really mesh with bigger lenses, so that's something to keep in mind. The last thing that I want to address is who is the XE4 for? What type of customer is going to enjoy this camera? Who should buy this camera? I want to start by saying that I do not believe that this is an entry-level camera. I think it's different, but I would not call it entry-level. Because in my opinion, simple doesn't mean amateur, right? Because really, if that was the case, the best beginner camera would always be a cell phone. But just because they are simple doesn't mean they are good for someone who doesn't really know what they're doing and is looking to learn. Fujifilm, they make entry-level cameras. I think like the X-T30, X-T32 would be considered a more entry-level camera, at least in my opinion. It's the camera that I would recommend to someone who's looking to get into photography, because when it comes to digital, the important thing is that digital provides access and ease of use, not ability. It provides accessibility. And I think for an amateur, what a beginner digital camera should do is provide ease of use and access to things that a beginner might want to get into. Family portraiture, light sports, right? Something that's a little bit quicker. Easier access to, I guess, different, more niche styles of shooting that they may want to dabble in and learn about, rather than like a minimalist approach and learning how to kind of do those things from scratch or doing those things with less. A good entry-level camera sets an amateur up for success. That's not to say cameras like the X Pro, the X100 series, XT series, any other more prosumer, pro-level camera can't be used by an amateur, and they can't be used as good learning tools. It's just you want access to a lot of different things that they may want to dabble in and being able to kind of handhold them into those things. I don't think the XE4 does that well. And in the same breath, I don't think that this is really a pro camera either. That doesn't mean that a pro can't use and enjoy this camera. I don't use these cameras to make money. I use them to enjoy them. It's my hobby. So I don't need a lot of those pro features. I don't need a lot of that fancy stuff. This camera doesn't provide a lot of easy, quick, on-the-fly access to more niche shooting styles. I guess the best example I could think of is portraiture. Sure, you can do portraiture on this camera, but it doesn't have in-body image stabilization. So using longer lenses that you may want to use, if they don't have optical stabilization, might be a little bit tougher. You have to use a tripod, right? It's those little things that for a pro who's trying to make money with their camera needs to be able to do really quickly, needs to not have things holding them back. So considering those things, I think this camera is for someone who wants a no-nonsense experience, who wants to be able to pick it up and use it and set it up in a way that works for them, just like I have, grab it and go and enjoy it for what it is great at. It's the same kind of thinking when you have someone who is shooting a lot of film, they really love rangefinders. Rangefinders do a certain type of shooting really, really well. There are things that you can use to your advantage when it comes to these form factors. And if you are, again, the type of person who is comfortable with that, who is happy to pick something up, grab it and go, and really knows how to get intimate with the advantages that simplicity and the advantages that a camera like the XE4 can provide you, you are going to be very, very happy. I don't think you should buy this camera expecting it to do everything all of the time. I think that is generally unrealistic for most cameras. I mean, you know, we're talking about getting into some of the more pro level cameras if that's what you want. And with that comes a high cost. They're generally much bigger, and that's not what everybody wants. If you are that type of person, if you want a camera that is grab and go, that is simple and excels in what it's good at, and you don't worry about the stuff that it can't do, you're gonna be very, very happy with the XE4. I know I am. And if you do have one and you know you're thinking about one, let me know what you think, drop a comment, all that wonderful stuff. So yeah, my name is Zach. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Later.